Some streets seem to promise safety just by the way they look. You know the kind, and where the lawns are edged just right, the mailboxes stand in neat rows, and the air smells faintly of fresh-cut grass on Saturdays. My parents called it peace and quiet. I called it finally getting the normal neighborhood I'd been sketching in my notebook since I was 8 years old. We moved into 2410 Willow Bend Drive in the fall of 2011. It was a pale yellow two-story with peeling white trim, old wood floors that groaned under your feet, and windows that rattled whenever the wind picked up. My room faced the side yard, where a wall of untrimmed shrubs pushed up against the siding. Beyond that, a tall wooden fence divided our property from the neighbors. That neighbor was Mr. Briggs. My mom always referred to him in a tone halfway between polite and uneasy. Quiet Mr. Briggs. He was the kind of man who didn't wave when you drove by and never seemed to leave except to mow his already perfect lawn. I only caught glimpses of him at first, tall, thin, gray hair combed straight back, expression unreadable. 9 days after we moved in, I was at my desk sketching the houses across the street. The lamplight cast everything in warm yellow when I heard it. Tap, tap, tap. Soft, deliberate, against the glass to my right. I turned quickly. Nothing. The shrubs outside barely moved in the still air. I told myself it was nothing and went back to my sketch. The next night, it came again. 3 slow taps. I leaned closer, hand hovering over the blinds, but something inside me resisted pulling them open. At breakfast, I mentioned it to my dad. "Old houses make noises," he said without looking up from his coffee. "Shifts." "This wasn't the house," I told him. "It was outside." Mom offered, "Probably just branches. We'll trim them." But they never did. Wood expands, glass, I tried to ignore it. But the sound came every few nights, always around the same time. Sometimes it was faint, sometimes a little louder. It became a part of my evenings, the waiting, the listening. 2 weeks later, my younger brother Luke knocked on my door after dinner. He looked uneasy. "You hear knocking too? At your window?" "Yeah," I said. "It's at mine now too." That night we sat in my room together, determined to catch whatever was making the sound. At 11:12, there it was. 3 taps, a pause, then a 4th. Slow, measured. We didn't speak. By the time Friday came, it had escalated into a pounding, not frantic, deliberate. Luke shouted from his room, "Cut it out!" Thinking I was playing some kind of joke, I didn't even move from my bed. The next morning, I noticed something under my window. 3 glass marbles and a few smooth white pebbles. We didn't own marbles. Neither did any of the neighborhood kids we'd met. From then on, the air around the house felt different, like something was just barely out of sight. Chapter 2, Luke and I started paying more attention to the fence line. There was a narrow gap between 2 warped boards, just wide enough to see movement if you were sitting on the porch steps. One afternoon after school, we both spotted it, a shadow pacing back and forth in the neighbor's yard. It was Mr. Briggs. He walked slowly, hands clasped behind his back, muttering to himself. Every so often, he'd stop mid-step, lift his head, and stare directly toward the gap in the fence. I tried to pretend I was still focused on my sketchbook, but I could feel his gaze. "Why is he looking at us like that?" Luke whispered. "Don't look back," I told him. That night I brought it up to Mom. She brushed it off. "He's probably just a little eccentric, not everyone's a people person." "But he's watching us," I said. "Ethan, you watch people all the time when you're sketching," she countered. "Anything." Doesn't mean a week later the knocking stopped entirely. Right after our grandfather came to stay for the weekend. Grandpa was a big guy, the kind of man who could fix anything with a hammer and duct tape. He slept in the guest room downstairs, and for the first time in weeks, the nights were quiet. 2 days after he left, the sound came back. Sharper now, faster. Luke and I started sleeping with our blinds closed, but that didn't stop the noise. One night I woke to a faint scratching at the glass. My heart thudded in my ears. The scratching turned into a slow, dragging sound along the wall beneath the window. I sat completely still, barely breathing. Then I saw it in the faint reflection from my desk lamp, the outline of a man's head, not pressed against the glass, but close enough that I knew he was watching. I didn't move, didn't even blink, and then it was gone. The next morning, I told Luke what I saw. He didn't laugh or call me crazy. He just nodded slowly and said, "I think he's trying to see inside." I talking about it around Mom and Dad. They didn't want to hear it, and we didn't want to sound paranoid. But we started noticing patterns. The knocks came on certain nights, usually Fridays and Sundays, and almost always between 11 and 1. By February, it wasn't just knocks. Sometimes there'd be a faint rustling in the shrubs, like someone shifting their weight. Once, Luke swore he heard footsteps in the side yard. I told him he must have imagined it, but deep down I knew he hadn't. Then came the night of the rainstorm. The wind was lashing the house, and I thought maybe the weather would drown out the usual noises. Around midnight, I heard a wet thud against the siding, then a dragging sound like something sliding down the wall. I stood at my window, trying to work up the nerve to look out. The lightning gave me the answer. For less than a second, the yard lit up, and I saw him. Mr. Briggs was standing in the narrow strip between the fence and the shrubs, soaked to the bone, just staring at my window. The next morning, I told Mom. She frowned but didn't say anything. Dad finally spoke up. "Maybe I'll have a word with him," he said, though it sounded more like a promise he didn't plan to keep. A week later, Luke and I were walking home from school when we passed Mr. Briggs in his driveway. He didn't say anything, but his eyes followed us the whole way down the street. That night, I found another little pile of marbles under my window. I started keeping a flashlight by my bed. Luke kept a baseball bat. We never said it out loud, but both of us knew, whatever this was, it wasn't going to stop on its own. It was late March when everything came to a head. The air was just starting to warm up at night, and Luke and I had our windows cracked open a little for the first time that year. Around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of someone whispering my name. At first I thought I was dreaming, but then it came again, just barely loud enough to hear over the hum of the fridge downstairs. "Ethan." I sat up slowly, my heart pounding so hard it made my vision pulse. The whisper wasn't coming from inside my room. It was coming from the other side of the glass. I grabbed the flashlight, but before I could turn it on, there was a sudden, sharp bang on the window. Not a tap, not a knock. A full force hit that rattled the glass. I jumped back and almost dropped the light. From down the hall, Luke shouted, "Get away from my window." His voice cracked halfway through. I bolted into his room, and we both stood there, backs against the wall, listening. There were slow, deliberate footsteps moving away through the side yard. We didn't sleep. At sunrise, we checked outside. Under Luke's window was a scrap of lined notebook paper, wet from the dew. The writing was messy, almost scribbled. "Keep away from the fence." We showed it to Mom. She paled and told Dad to call the landlord. By dinner, the conversation had shifted from, maybe we should say something, to, maybe we should move. 2 weeks later, we were loading boxes into the back of a moving truck. We never saw Mr. Briggs during those last days, but I felt his presence every time I walked past the fence. It was like the air got heavier, thicker. The night before we left, I woke one last time to the sound of tapping. I didn't look. I didn't need to. The new place was only a few miles away, but it felt like another world. No tall fence pressing in on the side yard. No overgrown shrubs against the windows. Luke and I could breathe again. At least that's what we told ourselves. For the first couple of weeks, nothing happened. No knocks, no marbles, no scraps of paper. I unpacked my sketchbooks, and Luke started riding his bike around the neighborhood without glancing over his shoulder every 2 minutes. It should have been the end of it. Then one Saturday in late April, Mom ran into the woman who'd rented our old house. She was at the grocery store standing in line with her teenage son. They got to talking, and Mom came home with a look I'll never forget. Part shock, part confirmation of something she'd been trying not to believe. She said her son found a note under their door, Mom told us at dinner. away from the fence. Last warning. It said, "Keep your kid." Luke put his fork down. Mom nodded. At their windows. Last warning? Her husband caught Mr. Briggs standing in their driveway one night. Just staring. I didn't say anything, but it all clicked. The marbles, the pacing, the way the noises stopped when Grandpa was there. None of it was random. He'd been watching us. My bed had been only 3 feet from where he stood, night after night. I kept thinking about the rainstorm, about the way he'd been standing there, motionless, while the water ran down his face. I wondered how many times I'd been asleep while he was outside, looking in. It was weeks before I could fall asleep without checking every lock twice. Luke started keeping his blinds closed all the time. And even though the new house had a wide-open backyard, I couldn't bring myself to sit near the windows after dark. Mr. Briggs never showed up again. Maybe the move was enough to break whatever strange fixation he'd had. Or maybe he just found someone new to watch. I still draw houses sometimes, though never at night, and never from a desk right by a window. And sometimes, when I'm up late and the street outside is quiet, I swear I can hear it again. Tap, 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 even though I know it's just my memory playing tricks. But that's the thing about people like him. Once they've been that close, even without touching you, they leave a mark you can't draw away or scrub clean. It stays. Some dangers don't come with loud warnings or dramatic scenes. They creep in quietly, testing boundaries, seeing how close they can get before someone pushes back. Trusting your instincts isn't paranoia. It's survival. If something feels wrong, don't wait for proof. Listen to that uneasy voice in your head, because sometimes it's the only thing standing between you and the moment when wrong turns into too late. If you'd asked me before my 17th birthday what the scariest thing in my life was, I would have said auditions. I lived for theater, the spotlights, the smell of stage makeup, the energy of a full house. But auditions always made my stomach knot. Fear was supposed to be about missed lines, forgotten lyrics, or maybe tripping over a prop in front of everyone. I didn't know yet that fear could be quiet, patient, watching. My mom thought having my party at home was cozier. I thought it sounded like a downgrade from the karaoke bar I'd wanted. But she promised to invite my friends, rent a karaoke machine, and bake the triple-layer chocolate cake she'd been making for me since I was 6. By 8:15 that Saturday night, the living room was full of music and laughter. The smell of pizza and frosting hung in the air, the kind of smell that makes you believe nothing bad can happen in a place like this. It was halfway through my first song when I saw him. Through the living room window, beyond the porch light's reach, a tall man stood at the edge of our yard. He wore a flannel shirt, his hands in his pockets, his head tilted just enough to look like he was listening to me sing. He wasn't a neighbor I knew. He wasn't moving. I leaned toward my mom, lowering my voice so my friends wouldn't hear. "Do you know that guy outside?" She glanced over her shoulder and shrugged. Probably just walking by. But he didn't walk by. He stood there for nearly 10 minutes, the same blank expression, until I stepped to the window and closed the curtains. His eyes tracked me the whole way. The next day I saw him again, across the street this time, leaning against the fence of the empty house for sale. No expression, no phone in his hand, no cigarette, just watching. I told myself he was probably harmless. People linger sometimes. Neighborhoods aren't perfect. But deep down, something about him was already unsettling. A week later, I took the trash out after dark. The air was sharp with late October chill, and the only sound was the hum of a streetlight. Halfway down the side path, I caught movement by the fence. He was there, standing still, half hidden behind the wooden slats. Hello?" I said, my voice shaky. He didn't move, didn't answer. I backed away slowly, then turned and hurried inside. I locked the door, my heart still pounding. Dad was watching TV in the living room. When I told him, he frowned. Maybe he's a new neighbor getting his bearings. New neighbors say hello, They don't lurk behind fences at night, but I didn't push it. Dad didn't seem worried, and I didn't want to sound paranoid. That was the first time I felt the shift, the way your own house can suddenly feel less like shelter and more like a thin-walled stage where someone could be watching from the dark. The tapping started 2 nights later. At first, I thought it was branches brushing my bedroom window, but there were no trees on that side of the house. The sound was deliberate, spaced knocks. I froze in bed, listening. When I finally found the nerve to pull the curtain back, nothing was there. The next morning, I saw faint boot prints in the dirt below my window. The worst part wasn't the tapping, it was how he seemed to know when I was alone. One night I was doing a late karaoke practice with my headphones on. I caught movement outside and shut the music off. He was there, right against the glass. His breath fogged the pain. I stumbled back so hard I knocked over my microphone stand. Dad ran in, but by the time he looked, the man was gone. The next afternoon, Mrs. Kenner, our next-door neighbor, stopped me at the mailbox. She spoke in a low voice, glancing toward our house. "That man's been pacing between our houses at night, always watching your windows." That night, Dad called the police. An officer took our statement but said, without proof of trespassing, there wasn't much they could do. From then on, I kept my curtains shut even during the day. It didn't stop. I'd catch glimpses of him from the corner of my eye, across the street, in the alley behind the house, even at the far end of our driveway, always watching, never speaking. Then came the final straw. It was just past 3 in the morning when our doorbell camera pinged. Dad checked the footage. There he was, standing on our porch staring into the camera. He held something in his hand. A cassette tape. The police took it, but not before Dad played it. The sound was muffled, grainy, but unmistakable. My voice, singing in my bedroom. That meant he'd been close enough, long enough, to record me. We moved out 2 weeks later. Even now, years later, I think about that man. How he never shouted, never broke in, never touched me, but still managed to fill my home with fear. I learned that danger doesn't always announce itself with violence. Sometimes it's just the steady presence of someone who won't go away. Sometimes it's in the way the hair on your neck rises when you know you're being watched. The moral is one I keep with me always. If something feels wrong, trust that feeling. Don't wait for proof to protect yourself. Sometimes starting over feels like stepping into a clean photograph. Sharp lines, good light, no trace of what came before. That's what I told myself when I left Seattle for Portland in the summer of 2011. My life there had been blurred and overexposed, a breakup that felt more like a public collapse than a private ending, work that had gone stale, friendships stretched thin over too many apologies. I found a small apartment in a weathered 3-story building on the east side. It wasn't much, but it had character. A rooftop garden tangled with tomato vines, hallways that carried the faint scent of coffee and rain, and balconies that looked directly into each other like mirrors. My place faced west, so the sunsets came right to my door. The first night was boxes and takeout. The second night, I met Daniel Hayes. I was unpacking in my living room when a voice drifted in from the balcony opposite mine. "You're new here, huh?" I slid the glass door open and stepped out. Across the narrow gap, leaning on his railing, was a tall man in his late 30s. He had a faint, easy smile, the kind people wear when they're trying to make you feel comfortable. "I moved in 2 days ago," I said. "Daniel," he replied. "Me. Night shift security guard. Means I'm around at weird hours. Don't mind." We talked for a few minutes. Small stuff. He told me the best coffee shop was 2 blocks over, the corner store stayed open until midnight, and the rooftop was a great spot for sunsets. Something about his voice was steady, reassuring, like a low hum in the background. For weeks, our interactions stayed light. He'd hold the lobby door if I came in with groceries, wave when he saw me on the balcony. Once, when I left a plant out while visiting my sister, I came back to find it watered. I thought it was thoughtful. It would take me months to realize that sometimes kindness is just a door someone builds to walk into your life, and maybe your home, without you realizing until it's too late. It was late August when I first felt the edges of something wrong. I'd gone up to the rooftop to photograph the sky. The light was that soft orange haze you only get for a few minutes before the sun drops. I was framing a shot when I heard steps behind me. "Daniel." "I saw your curtains move," he said. "Figured you were heading up." I laughed awkwardly. "You can see my curtains from your place?" He smiled but didn't answer. I told myself not to make it a big deal. A week later, I noticed my front doormat was turned sideways. Then my balcony chair was in a different spot. I chalked it up to wind. But then there was my camera bag. I kept it inside, zipped on a shelf. One night, I found it unzipped on the couch. I told myself I'd probably moved it and forgotten. That's the thing. You explain away small things because the alternative is too uncomfortable to accept. The moment I stopped explaining was the night it rained. It was around 11:40 p.m., and I was editing photos when I heard faint tapping on the sliding balcony door. My heart thudded. I pulled the curtain back a sliver. Daniel stood there soaked through, holding one of my photo prints. Through the glass. "You dropped this," he said. The print had been inside my apartment earlier that day. I locked my bedroom door and called my older brother. I whispered so low my own words sounded strange to me. "Call the police," he said. By the time the officers arrived, Daniel's lights were off, his balcony empty. They found no sign of forced entry, so they told me they'd have a word with him. For 2 weeks, Daniel didn't speak to me, but I'd catch glimpses, him standing on his balcony in the middle of the night, or lingering in the hallway just far enough away to pretend it was coincidence. One evening I got home later than usual. As I slid my key into the lock, I felt eyes on me. I turned. Daniel stood at the end of the hallway. He didn't wave, didn't speak, just watched until I went inside. I started keeping my curtains closed all the time. I moved my camera bag into my bedroom and locked the door when I wasn't home. I told friends about it, but without proof. It was just weird neighbor vibes. Then came the envelope. It was slipped under my door on a Sunday morning. Inside was a single photograph. Me, asleep in my bed, hair spilled across the pillow, the faint light of dawn coming through the blinds. The angle was from my balcony glass. No note, just the photo. My throat went dry, my hands shaking as I flipped it over, hoping for an explanation that wasn't there. The next day, another envelope. This time, a short note. "You look peaceful when you're not worrying." That's when the adrenaline turned into clarity. I called a friend and asked if I could crash at her place for a few days. I didn't tell Daniel. I didn't even tell the landlord. I packed 2 bags, left my furniture, my plants, my dishes, everything. I locked the door, walked away, and didn't look back. I never returned to that building. My friend helped me find a sublet, and from there, I moved into a different part of the city entirely. For months, every time I passed a building with facing balconies, my chest tightened. I'd close my curtains at night without thinking. I've since learned that safety isn't just about locks and keys. It's about knowing that small trespasses aren't always harmless. People who cross boundaries quietly will cross bigger ones if they think they can get away with it. Listen to your instincts before the situation escalates. You don't owe politeness to someone who makes you feel unsafe. I'd never been much of a risk taker, but when you're 24, fresh out of grad school and finally holding the first salaried job of your life, you start convincing yourself that maybe you're ready to live on your own terms. In the spring of 2016, that meant moving into a small third-floor walk-up in Logan Square, Chicago. The apartment was nothing fancy. Scuffed hardwood floors, thin walls that seemed to amplify my neighbor's every sneeze, and a kitchen barely big enough for one person to turn around in. But it had character, or so I told myself. The kind of place that creaked in the right ways. It also had a view. If you leaned out my bedroom window, you could see the tree-lined street on one side, and on the other, a narrow alley wedged between our building and the next. Across that alley stood an older brick apartment complex, taller than ours. with fire escapes zigzagging down its back wall like rusted skeletons. Most of its windows stayed dark, curtains drawn tight. Except one. The second floor, center left. The blinds there were always half open. From the first night I moved in, I had the uneasy sense that someone was behind them, standing just far enough back to be hidden in shadow. My landlord, Mr. Keller, was a man in his 60s, with a permanent smell of cigarette smoke clinging to his jacket. When I asked casually about the unit across the alley, he gave a shrug. "Some guy named Miller," he said, jingling his keys. "Keeps to himself, pays his rent, don't think I've ever seen him out much." That was the end of it for him, but not for me. At first I told myself it was nothing. I was working long hours at the architecture firm, too tired to dwell on shadows and windows. Still, every time I stayed up late drafting floor plans, I'd catch myself glancing out, seeing that same dim light in the distance, those same half-open blinds. Sometimes the faint movement of the slats would make me think someone had just shifted position. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, but a quiet part of me didn't believe it. One rainy Thursday night in April, I was closing my curtains before bed when I saw it. A small burst of white light, like the flicker of a camera flash, from that very window. My hand froze on the curtain cord. The blinds stilled. The light in the room went dark, and I stood there staring until my pulse slowed enough for me to move. The next morning, an envelope was slid under my door. Inside was a single black and white photograph of me. I was standing in my bedroom the night before, head bent toward my laptop, lit only by the desk lamp. The picture was taken from outside. No note, just the image. I stared at it until my coffee went cold. My first thought was that it had to be a joke. Maybe some bored teenager in the building. Maybe an overzealous street photographer with an odd sense of humor. But the angle was too perfect, too intimate. It was my private space, captured without my knowing. I didn't tell anyone. Not my boss, not my parents. I folded the photo in half, stuffed it in my desk drawer, and told myself to forget it. I didn't yet realize that pretending something isn't happening only gives it more room to grow. Over the next week, it happened again. The first time I came home to find my doormat pushed several inches from its usual spot. Small detail, probably nothing, but I had never once moved it myself. The second time, a knock sounded at my door around midnight. 3 soft raps spaced evenly. When I opened it, the hallway was empty. I began locking my bedroom window at night. It was a narrow sash window with an old metal latch that never felt entirely secure, but it gave me a small illusion of control. I started keeping the curtains closed more often. Even so, I still felt it, the weight of that window across the alley. The third incident was more direct. I was in the building's basement laundry room on a Sunday afternoon, folding a pile of towels, when I heard footsteps on the stairs. A man I'd never seen before descended slowly into the dim room. He was tall and lean, with thinning hair and a faded green jacket that looked like it belonged to another decade. "New to the building?" he asked, his voice low and friendly in a way that felt practiced. "I've been here a few months," I said, keeping my tone polite but cool. He stepped closer. "Weather. You keep your curtains open a lot," he remarked, as if commenting on the "it's nice, makes the place feel alive." I managed a tight smile, stuffed the towels in my basket, and left without looking back. I didn't ask his name, and he didn't offer it. That night, I closed my curtains before bed, tugging the cord until the fabric was tight against the window frame. But the next morning, they were open halfway. I knew I had locked my window latch. I tried to tell myself I must have forgotten, but the thought didn't stick. By the third night, I was sleeping with my phone in my hand, flashlight app ready. At 2:15 a.m., I woke to the faint scrape of the window sliding upward. My breath caught. Slowly, I turned my head toward the sound, just in time to see pale fingers curl over the sill from the outside. I shouted, snatched the desk lamp from the table beside me, and hurled it toward the window. The fingers vanished instantly, and the only sound was the quick retreat of footsteps echoing into the alley. When the police arrived, they found no sign of forced entry. The latch, they noted, was still intact. Maybe it had been left unlocked. They suggested I install a secondary lock, handed me a brochure on home safety, and left. 2 days later, I packed 2 suitcases, left my security deposit behind, and moved in with a coworker across town. I never gave notice. I didn't go back for the rest of my things until my father came to help me in broad daylight. The first few nights away from the apartment, I barely slept. My coworker's place was smaller and noisier, with the rumble of the L train cutting through every hour. But I still felt safer there. It was only once I'd left that I let myself consider what had been happening. Each moment that had felt strange but harmless, the open blinds, the moved doormat, the knocks in the night, had been steps in a slow escalation. Looking back, the pattern was obvious. At the time, I had wanted so badly for it not to be real that I brushed off every warning. My landlord called me a week later. "You're not coming back, are you?" he asked. "No," I said simply. "Did you rent my unit yet?" "Not yet, but that guy across the alley, Miller, he's gone. Moved out 2 days after you left. Didn't even tell his landlord, just cleared out." The words sat heavy in my stomach. I didn't ask where he went. Months later, while walking home from the grocery store, I passed through a quieter street in the neighborhood. Something made me glance up at a second-floor window in a brick building. Half-open blinds, a shadow just barely visible behind them. My heart gave a small, traitorous jump. I told myself it wasn't him. Couldn't be. But the truth was, once you've seen a face in the dark, you can't ever really be sure it's gone. I still dream about that window sometimes. In the dream, the blinds lift slowly, and a pale face appears, smiling faintly, as though it's been waiting for me to notice. When I wake, I lie in the dark for a moment, listening for the sound of a window sliding open. I never hear it, but I always check the lock anyway. Your boundaries are your first and last defense. Ignore the small violations, and you may not see the danger until it's already in your home. There are places that feel older than they look, not just in the creak of a staircase or the uneven floorboards, but in the way the air seems to hold on to the past. When I signed the lease for my 1-bedroom in Burlington, Vermont, the building felt like that. A 3-story brick relic with 6 apartments, narrow hallways that smelled faintly of varnish and dust, and a shared basement with wire mesh cages for storage. It was the kind of place that made you think of neighbors chatting in the stairwell and Sunday mornings filled with the sound of someone's radio. I'd just turned 30, working as an assistant editor at a small publishing house downtown. Rent wasn't cheap, but the location was perfect. A 10-minute walk to work, coffee shops on the corner, and a rent figure I could make work if I cooked more than I ate out. My apartment was on the 2nd floor, with a view of maple trees that in late September were already starting to burn orange and red. The day I moved in, I met Frank Dawson, the man who lived directly above me. He appeared at the stairwell just as I was wrestling a box through the door, tall and solid with weathered hands and a cigarette tucked behind one ear. His smile was polite, if not exactly warm. "Need a hand with that?" he asked. Before I could answer, he lifted the box from my arms with surprising ease. "Don't mind the creaks at night," he added, as though reading my mind. "This place is older than both of us put together." We didn't talk long. He carried the box to my living room, set it down, and left with a short nod. Still, I thought it was decent of him to help. In a building this small, good neighbor relations felt important. The first few weeks were ordinary enough. I'd hear Frank's footsteps overhead in the evenings, the muffled hum of his TV, sometimes his voice on the phone. He kept to himself, and I was fine with that. But then small things began to shift, subtle enough that at first I didn't think much of them. The first was my silver bracelet. My grandmother had given it to me before she passed away, and I always kept it in a small ceramic dish on my dresser. One morning it was gone. I searched my apartment twice, pulling out drawers, checking under furniture. A week later, I found it in my kitchen drawer, under a folded dish towel. I told myself I must have been distracted, put it there without thinking. But even as I closed the drawer, a cold ripple of doubt ran through me. Then my throw blanket, always left draped over the couch, was twice folded into a neat square when I came home from work. Once, a coffee mug I'd left upside down on the drying rack was sitting on the counter, its handle turned toward the door as if waiting for me. They were such small things you could dismiss. And I did. At first. But each time, the feeling of being alone in my apartment shifted, like a door slowly closing behind me. It was late October when I went down to the basement for the first time. The weather had turned sharply cold and I needed my heavy winter coat. Each tenant had a storage cage down there, wire mesh from floor to ceiling, each secured with a padlock. Mine was the third on the left. The basement was dim, lit by a single bulb that flickered just enough to make the shadows shift. The air was damp and cold, with that sour smell old basements carry. When I reached my cage, I noticed deep scratches around the padlock's keyhole. They looked fresh. Inside, one of my boxes was open, and my coat lay on the floor as though it had been pulled out and dropped. I froze, listening, but the basement was silent. I grabbed the coat, shut the cage, and told myself someone must have mistaken my unit for theirs. It didn't make sense. The cages were clearly numbered, but it was the only explanation I could stomach. The next day, I mentioned it to Claire, my downstairs neighbor, as casually as I could. She frowned and lowered her voice. "Frank's always down there," she said. "Says he's fixing things, but half the time he doesn't have tools. Just stands around listening. You can hear everything from down there. People walking, talking, even moving furniture." Her words lodged in my mind like a splinter. I told myself not to overthink it, but that night, when I heard Frank's footsteps pacing back and forth overhead, I found myself wondering if he was listening for mine. A week later, it happened. It was just past 12:30 a.m. when I woke to a faint metallic scraping. My first thought was that it was coming from the street, but as I lay still, the sound sharpened into something deliberate, the slow turn of a key in my front door. My chest tightened. I slipped out of bed and padded barefoot to the door, pressing my eye to the peephole. The hallway was empty. The scraping stopped. The next morning, I went straight to the landlord, Mr. Keller. He hesitated when I told him what had happened. "Frank used to have a spare set of keys," he admitted. "A handyman. I thought I'd gotten them all back. Helped with repairs before I could afford. He promised to change the locks, but something in his tone told me he doubted the urgency." 2 nights later, I learned just how wrong I'd been. It was a Wednesday evening, and I was working late on my laptop when I heard Frank moving around upstairs. It struck me because earlier that day he'd mentioned he was going out of town for the night to visit a friend. I muted my music and listened. Heavy footsteps, the sound of a chair scraping. Then, from below, the faint clang of the basement door closing. I hesitated for maybe 10 seconds before grabbing my phone and heading downstairs. The air grew colder with each step. From the shadows, I could see the faint glow of the basement bulb. Frank was in my storage cage. The padlock hung open, my boxes torn apart. He was flipping through a stack of my old photographs, holding each one close to his face. His expression wasn't quite a smile, more like someone studying something precious. A floorboard under me creaked. His head snapped up, our eyes locked. "You shouldn't be down here this late," he said, his voice low. I ran. I locked my apartment door and called the police. They arrived quickly, but Frank's apartment was dark by the time they knocked. In the basement, the officer noted there was no forced entry to my cage. Having an old landlord's key didn't count as breaking in. The next evening, an envelope was slid under my door. Inside was my silver bracelet and a single Polaroid photograph of me, asleep in my bed, my head turned toward the window. On the back, in block letters, it read, "You looked peaceful." I didn't sleep that night. By morning, I'd arranged to stay with a coworker. I left behind my couch, my dishes, even my plants. Anything I couldn't carry in 2 trips stayed behind. Even now, basements make my skin crawl. And sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I swear I can hear the slow scrape of a key in a lock. Never ignore the smallest signs that your space has been violated. Safety isn't something you can regain once it's been taken. It's something you must guard from the very first moment it's threatened. Looking back, I think I mistook quiet for safety. It was December 2014, and after the end of a long, draining relationship, I needed somewhere no one knew my name. I moved to Boise because it was far enough from my family in Washington to feel like a fresh start, but close enough to get back if I ever needed to. The apartment I found was on the 2nd floor of a 2-story horseshoe-shaped building. From my balcony, I could see the whole parking lot, every car, every person who came and went. That visibility made me feel like I had the upper hand, like nothing could surprise me. The inside wasn't much. Beige carpet, a fridge that hummed like it was struggling to keep up, and walls painted in a shade of white that made you think of waiting rooms. But it was mine, and for the first time in years, I could put a chair wherever I wanted without someone telling me it looked wrong. My cat, Murphy, took to it immediately, curling up in the 1 square of sunlight that fell across the living room floor every afternoon. On my 2nd day there, I met the man who lived directly below me. He was outside as I carried a box of dishes up the stairs. "Name's Grant," he said, leaning against the railing with a limp in his right leg. His voice had that scratchy quality of someone who'd smoked for years. "You'll like it here. Peaceful place. Nothing much happens." At first, he seemed like a good neighbor. He waved when I got home, offered me tomatoes from his garden in the spring, and even helped me shovel the stairs after a snowstorm. I told myself it was just small-town friendliness, even though Boise wasn't really small town. But I noticed something. He always seemed to be outside when I came or went. If I left at 6 a.m., he'd be on his porch, coffee in hand. If I came home after 9, he'd be getting the mail. Once, after a late shift, I saw his shadow in the lit rectangle of his living room window at 1 a.m., just standing there. A month in, I came home to find my balcony door unlocked. I chalked it up to stress and fatigue. Then it happened again a week later. The 3rd time, I noticed a pair of my work shoes, left inside the door, sitting neatly outside on the balcony. Murphy couldn't have moved them. I started double-checking locks every time I left. The first time I felt real fear was in January. I woke up to the sound of snow crunching outside. My blinds were shut, but I saw the outline of someone standing in the parking lot, facing up at my window. The shape was familiar, the slope of the shoulders, the bulk of the winter coat. Grant. He didn't move. I crouched on the floor, my heart hammering in my chest, until finally the shadow was gone. I told myself I'd imagined it. It was easier than facing what I suspected, that he was watching me. But then I talked to Sarah, the woman across the hall. She hesitated before saying, "He's out there a lot. Sometimes he just stares up at the building. I keep my blinds closed all the time." That should have been the moment I did something, called the police, broke my lease. Instead, I went about my routine, though I avoided the balcony at night. I started parking on the far side of the lot so I could walk straight up the stairs without passing his porch. Then, one day in February, I came home early. The sun was just starting to set. I had a bag of groceries in one hand and my keys in the other when I froze. Standing on my balcony, my 2nd floor balcony, was Grant. He didn't flinch or look surprised. He just smiled down at me and said, "Just making sure your door was secure." I forced a nod, went inside, and locked the door. My hands shook as I put the groceries away. That night I barely slept. In the morning, I went to the property manager. She leaned back in her chair and sighed. "We can't accuse someone without proof. Just keep your doors locked." The police weren't much better. "Much we can do," the officer said. "Unless he's damaged property or stolen something, there's not." I started sleeping with a chair wedged under the balcony door handle. Murphy seemed restless too, his ears twitching at sounds I couldn't hear. I told myself I just had to get through my lease. It was 2 weeks later when the envelope appeared. I'd worked a late shift and trudged up the stairs, balancing my bag and the mail. Taped to my door was a plain white envelope. Inside was a Polaroid of my car in the parking lot, taken from outside my bedroom window. On the back, in shaky handwriting, "You're safe while I'm watching." The air went out of me. I sat on the couch holding that photo for a long time, my mind spiraling. How many more pictures had he taken? From where? I put the photo in a drawer, grabbed my phone, and called my sister. I didn't tell her everything, just that I was thinking about moving. That night I didn't sleep. Every creak of the building made me jolt. At 3 a.m., I heard the slow crunch of footsteps outside. Murphy hissed and bolted under the bed. I didn't dare look. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I called in sick to work, packed essentials into my car, and left the rest behind. Half my furniture, my deposit. I didn't care. I waited until Grant's car was gone, then carried my things down in quick, quiet trips. As I slid into the driver's seat, I glanced at his window. The curtain twitched. I didn't stick around to see if he came out. I drove straight to a friend's house 2 towns over. Later that week, I called the property manager to let her know I wasn't coming back. She didn't sound surprised. "You're not the first tenant to leave early from that unit," she said. "Some people just don't like the layout." But the way she said it told me she knew more. It's been years now. I've moved twice since then, always to buildings with secure entry and cameras in the lot. But I still can't cross a parking lot at night without feeling eyes on me. Sometimes when I'm home alone, I'll catch myself checking the locks 3 or 4 times in an evening. I never saw Grant again. I don't know if he kept watching other tenants or if he moved on. But I still think about that Polaroid. How many more were there? What else did he see? I learned something in that winter. Safety isn't about how quiet a place is or how many friendly nods you get from the neighbors. It's about paying attention to the small things, an unlocked door, a misplaced shoe, and trusting the part of you that says, something isn't right. Listen to your instincts the first time they speak. They're almost always telling the truth. Some winters feel heavier than others. February 2015 was one of those months, a kind of cold that sat in your bones and didn't let go. I was 31, living alone for the first time in years in a 3rd-floor walk-up at the Rowland Heights complex on the east side of Baltimore. The building wasn't luxury by any stretch. Faded carpet in the hallways, humming fluorescent lights that flickered whenever the wind howled through the cracked window panes, and a front lobby that smelled faintly of damp paper. I'd moved there after quitting my hotel job downtown. I told people I needed a change of pace, but the truth was, I was running on fumes. Too many double shifts, too many strangers yelling over the front desk, too many nights walking home in the dark wondering if I was just treading water in my own life. The Rowland Heights apartment was small but manageable on my bartending wages. I figured it would be a place to catch my breath. Baltimore winters make you think twice before going out, but my job didn't give me that luxury. I'd leave the bar well past midnight, coat pulled tight, weaving through the half-frozen puddles in the parking lot. That's where I first really noticed Carl. He lived in the unit next to mine, maybe late 40s, a little gaunt, with eyes that looked like they were always trying to read something just behind you. I'd seen him in passing, usually heading out while I was coming in, never more than a muttered hey between us. One night just before midnight, I came in from work to find him standing barefoot by the mailboxes. His jeans were wet to the knee, his hair plastered to his forehead, as if he'd been out in the rain for hours. I gave a quick evening and started toward the stairs. He stepped into my path. "Got $10 I could borrow?" he asked, voice flat. "Don't have it," I said, shifting my bag on my shoulder. His tone changed instantly. "You think you're better than me?" he hissed, leaning in close enough that I could smell wet tobacco on his breath. I didn't answer. I stepped around him and climbed the stairs, my heartbeat loud in my ears. By the time I reached my door, I could hear slow, heavy footsteps behind me. I got inside, locked up, and stood there listening. Silence. The next morning, I mentioned it to the landlord, a tired-looking woman named Janine who ran the building out of a small office in the basement. She didn't look surprised. "You're not the first," she said. "He's had complaints, mostly him hanging around the parking lot, bothering people for money, women especially." She pursed her lips. "Don't engage with him if you can help it." That advice stayed with me. Over the next week, I saw him twice in the lot, once leaning against the dumpster, once smoking under the stairwell. Both times, his eyes followed me until I disappeared inside. Then came a night when the rain came down in sheets, bouncing off the asphalt in silver splashes. It was close to midnight when I pulled in, parking 2 rows from the building. I spotted him crouched between 2 cars. For a second, I thought maybe he was working on an engine. But then he stood up slowly, grinning faintly. "You never called the cops, did you?" he said, voice carrying easily over the rain. I swallowed. "Go home, Carl." Instead, he stepped closer, his voice rising. "This is my building too, man. You can't push me out." I moved fast, splashing through puddles toward the door, fumbling for my keys. He was still talking, but the words blurred into the noise of the storm. I slammed the lobby door shut, the sound echoing down the empty hall. Minutes later, the banging started, not on my door, but on the wall that separated my bedroom from his unit. 3 slow, deliberate thuds, then silence. That was the night I called the police. They showed up 20 minutes later, by which time Carl had vanished. One officer, young and polite, took my statement. "We know him," he said. "He's been arrested for meth possession and trespassing before. If he threatens you again, call us right away." The reassurance felt paper thin. For the next few days, I kept my head down, leaving for work early and coming home later than usual, timing it so I wouldn't cross paths with him. Still, there were signs he was around. Cigarette butts near my door, the faint smell of smoke in the hallway when I came home. 3 nights later, it happened again. I was walking from my car toward the building, the lot slick from a light drizzle, when I heard footsteps behind me. Quick, splashing through puddles. I turned. Carl was coming straight at me, eyes wide, teeth clenched. I didn't wait to see what he wanted. I sprinted for the entrance, fumbling my keys as my heart pounded in my chest. He was close enough that I heard his breath when I shoved the door open and slammed it behind me. I called the police again, this time from just inside the lobby. They arrived in minutes. From the corner of the stairwell, I watched as they found him in the lot, leaning against the hood of a car. Words were exchanged, then cuffs came out. One officer later told me he'd been arrested for violating a restraining order filed by another tenant. After that night, I didn't see him again. His blinds stayed closed, and a week later, Janine confirmed he'd moved out, or been forced out. She didn't elaborate. But the damage had been done. For months afterward, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched in that parking lot. The sound of wet footsteps behind me would send my pulse racing, even if it was just another tenant coming in from the rain. Time has a way of sanding down the sharp edges of memory, but not all of them. Even now, years later, I can still see him standing by the mailboxes that first night, barefoot in the rain, staring at me like I'd trespassed in his territory. What I learned that winter wasn't about fear so much as awareness. You think you know your neighborhood because you walk the same steps every day, but you don't. You can't. People carry whole other lives in the apartment next to yours, and sometimes those lives spill over in ways you can't control. The moral is simple. Trust the warning signs. If someone's presence makes your skin crawl, don't talk yourself into ignoring it. Safety isn't about being polite. It's about knowing when to put distance between yourself and danger, no matter how small it seems at first. There's something about Portland in the fall that makes the world feel slower, quieter, like it's holding its breath. I moved here fresh out of college in 2017, but it wasn't until 2019 that I finally found a place I could call home. Well, sort of. Hawthorne Avenue was a good spot. Not too flashy, not too run down, but with character. The apartment building where Danny, Jess, and I lived was the kind of place that creaked under your footsteps and smelled faintly of damp wood and old smoke. It was affordable, and in Portland that felt like a victory. We were all 20-somethings, juggling jobs and classes, working hard but never quite feeling like we had it together. Our downstairs neighbor, a man named Mr. Daly, was a fixture of that building. Thin, pale, almost ghost-like in his gray hoodie that he wore through rain and shine. At first, he was mostly invisible, but not really. He noticed things, little things. "You don't get home until pretty late on Thursdays," he said once out of nowhere as I passed him in the hallway. His voice was soft, but it stuck in my head. And once, just after I'd laughed with Danny and Jess in the hallway, he muttered something about how my friends laughed louder when I wasn't around, like it was some kind of secret. I shrugged it off at first. Just a weird guy, harmless maybe. But something about the way he watched, like he was keeping score, made me uneasy. The unease crept in slowly, like a low fog rolling in from the river. One night, I came home from work around 8 and found our apartment door unlocked. Danny swore she had locked it before leaving that afternoon, and Jess was out of town visiting family. Nothing was missing except for a coffee mug that had been moved from the sink to the table. I told myself I must have left it there, distracted and tired. But a cold knot settled in my stomach. Then, the knocking started. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, a tapping on the wall shared with Daly's apartment. 3 slow knocks, a pause, then 2 more. The rhythm was deliberate, like a code. I muted the TV, heart pounding, but the silence that followed was heavier than the knocks themselves. When I turned the sound back up, the knocking came again. It wasn't just a one-time thing. It happened almost every night after that. One Saturday, as I was getting my mail, I bumped into Mr. Daly in the lobby. He was leaning against the wall, as if he'd been waiting. "You work late, don't you?" he said softly. "Yeah, sometimes," I answered, wary. "Must be hard walking up those dark stairs alone," he whispered. His voice was low, but it sliced through me. I nodded and hurried away. Then came the worst night. Danny and Jess were both out, and I was alone. Around 11:45 p.m., brushing my teeth, I heard the faint click of my front door latch. My breath caught. My toothbrush still in my mouth, I crept toward the hallway and peeked around the corner. The door was open a crack, and in that sliver of space I saw half of Mr. Daly's pale face. "Claire, you awake?" he whispered. Every muscle locked. "Get out," I shouted. My voice cracked. He didn't move at first, just stared, then finally stepped back and disappeared down the stairs. I called the police immediately. The police searched his apartment but found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no stolen items, just an empty, silent place. They promised to keep an eye on the building, but without clear evidence, their hands were tied. Days later, the weather turned foggy and wet. Coming home from work, I noticed fresh footprints on the fire escape outside our kitchen window. They stopped just short of the sill. Danny dismissed it as maintenance, but I wasn't so sure. Then, at 3:14 a.m., I woke to the sound of my bedroom window screen sliding slowly upward. The curtains shifted in the cold draft. I yanked them back, and there he was. Mr. Daly, inches from the glass, soaked from rain, eyes wide and unblinking. I screamed. He flinched and scrambled away, the metallic rattle of the fire escape echoing behind him. The police found him hiding in the basement maintenance shed later that night, clutching a flashlight and a small camera. They arrested him for trespassing, harassment, and unlawful surveillance. After Daly was evicted, the building felt quieter but not safer. Months passed, but every night I'd wake convinced I heard those 3 slow knocks on the wall. I learned that sometimes the biggest danger isn't what you see, but what you suspect, what you feel in the silence between knocks. Trust your instincts. If someone's presence unsettles you, If the small details don't add up, and don't ignore it. Speak up. Protect yourself. Because no apartment is just a building, and no neighbor is just a face you pass in the hallway. Sometimes safety means listening to the quiet warnings before they become screams. When I moved into that old red brick complex in Cincinnati, I wasn't expecting much. I was 24, broke, and working part-time at a hardware store just to pay the bills. The rent was cheap, $650 a month for a one-bedroom apartment with peeling paint on the stairs and a faint smell of mildew that seemed to settle into the walls. It was far from fancy, but it was mine. The building sat close to the train tracks, and in the spring of 2016, cold nights carried that damp, rusty smell that clung to everything. At first, I mostly kept to myself. Work, sleep, repeat. But living next to Randy Holcomb was impossible to ignore. Randy was late 30s, stocky, with a shaved head that gleamed under the dim hallway lights. His voice was low and deep, the kind of voice that doesn't need to raise volume to fill a room. At first, I only heard him. Music blasting at strange hours, slamming doors, muffled shouting through the thin walls that separated us. One day I ran into his girlfriend in the stairwell. She was younger, maybe mid-20s, with dark eyes that refused to meet mine. She wore a hoodie, even though it was warm outside. "You okay?" I asked, feeling awkward. She hesitated, then whispered, "Ever argue?" "I'm fine. Just, if he talks to you, don't argue, just agree." "Don't." Her words stuck with me. I didn't understand then how much I'd come to regret hearing them. Randy's presence became impossible to ignore. One night in early April, I got home around 1 a.m. The parking lot was empty except for a few cars, and a lone street lamp flickered overhead. Randy was standing between two vehicles, smoking a cigarette. He watched me as I climbed the stairs, never breaking eye contact. "Evening," I said, trying to sound casual. He didn't respond, just held my gaze, his face unreadable. Over the next few weeks, he began showing up everywhere. The laundry room, the mailbox area, even leaning against the railing outside my door. His questions were strange, unnerving. "You live alone, right?" "Yeah," I answered cautiously. "Good. No one to slow you down." I laughed nervously once, but there was no humor in his eyes, just something cold and empty. One night around 3 a.m. I heard him laughing loudly in the hallway. I peeked through my peephole and saw him pacing shirtless, muttering to himself. It sent a chill down my spine. One Thursday night, the noise through the wall escalated, muffled screaming followed by a loud crash like furniture tipping over. I froze, phone in hand, debating whether to call the police. Then silence. The next morning, I saw his girlfriend loading a large black trash bag into her car. When she caught me watching, she slammed the trunk shut and drove off quickly. I felt helpless, trapped by the thin walls and fear. 2 nights later, I came home from work to find Randy crouched near the dumpster at the far end of the lot. When he saw me, he straightened up and gave me a faint grin. "You work late, huh?" he said. "Yeah." "Late nights are dangerous around here." His voice was casual, but his eyes didn't lie. There was something more there, something I couldn't put into words. Then just before sunrise 3 days later, pounding on his door woke me. I looked out my window to see police officers yelling for him to open up. Minutes later, they forced entry. Rumors buzzed through the building like wildfire. Then the horrifying truth came out. Randy had killed his girlfriend sometime after midnight, dismembered her, and dumped the remains near the train tracks just a block away. The worst part? According to the timeline, he was actively hiding the evidence the night I saw him by the dumpster. I kept replaying every moment, his strange questions, the silence between noises, the way he seemed to be everywhere. The wall between us was paper thin. I could have been next. After Randy was arrested and evicted, the building grew quieter. But the fear lingered. Every argument behind the walls made me hold my breath, waiting for the silence that meant something worse. Living next to danger doesn't always mean violent confrontations. Sometimes it's the quiet, subtle signs. The laughter in the middle of the night, the conversations you overhear, the warning in a woman's whispered words. When something feels off, it probably is. Don't ignore the signs or brush off your gut feeling. Speak up, reach out. Sometimes your voice could be the difference between safety and tragedy, because the thin walls between neighbors aren't just walls. They're fragile lines between normal life and something much darker. I've always believed that home is where you feel safe, a place where your heart slows down and your worries can rest. But in the fall of 2004, when my family moved to that 2-story rental on Maplewood Drive in Asheville, North Carolina, I quickly learned that sometimes home can feel like the opposite. Cold, unfamiliar, and full of shadows you can't explain. I was 12 years old then, and my parents were hopeful about the fresh start. After a year of bouncing between apartments in the city, the rental house with its peeling white paint and creaky porch seemed like a dream. Bigger than anything we'd had before, with a big yard and a basement my dad promised would someday become his workshop. The neighborhood was quiet. Polite waves from neighbors who mostly kept to themselves. None of the noise or chaos from our old apartment. At least, that's how it seemed on the surface. I remember the first night vividly. After we finished unpacking, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan, listening to the faint hum of the heater. The house smelled of fresh paint and dust, but there was something else. Something cold. When I stepped out into the hallway, I felt a chill that wasn't from the heater's failure. It wrapped around me like an invisible weight. I tried to shake it off and told myself it was just my imagination. Our next-door neighbor was a man named Mr. Ward. I never saw him much during the day, but my mom met him once while we were moving boxes. She said he seemed friendly, but had an intense stare that made her uncomfortable. My dad joked about him, calling him that clock guy, because he looked like the kind of man who'd have dozens of ticking clocks in his basement. At first, I didn't pay much attention to it. Mr. Ward was just another quiet neighbor. But then, things started to feel off. It was a Saturday night a few weeks after we moved in. My cousins Jamie and Sam were visiting for a sleepover, and we were all packed into my room playing video games late into the night. The kind of night that should have been filled with laughter and snacks and the comforting buzz of the TV. But then, just as the clock hit midnight, we heard it. A strange laugh. Not loud or joyful, but forced and wrong, like someone trying to sound amused but failing. Jamie paused the game and looked at me. "Did you hear that?" I nodded slowly, eyes glued to the dark window. "It's outside." The backyard was empty when I looked out, nothing but shadows and the wind shaking the tree branches. Then the laugh came again, closer this time, as if right outside my bedroom wall. We froze, hearts pounding, afraid to even breathe. "Maybe it's Dad messing with us," Jamie whispered. I shook my head. "No way. He's asleep." Trying to prove it was nothing, I went to the front door and peeked through the peephole. The porch was empty, but as I stepped back inside, the laugh rang out again, this time directly at the door. We jumped back, eyes wide. None of us were brave enough to open it. The next morning I told my mom about it, but she dismissed it with a casual, "Someone walking their dog." Probably just, that was the start of something we couldn't explain. Over the following week, the laughter returned, always late at night, always that same forced, eerie sound. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, pacing along the side of the house, heading toward the backyard. One night, we killed the lights and huddled by the window, watching through the slats of the blinds. And there he was, Mr. Ward, standing in our backyard, head tilted back, grinning at nothing visible. His eyes looked hollow, fixed on something only he could see. Jamie whispered, "Why is he just standing there?" No one answered. The silence stretched out until Mr. Ward finally turned and disappeared down the street. The next morning, I noticed an old black and white photo hanging in our dining room, something the landlord must have left behind. It was a group of men in suits standing in front of our house from decades ago. My stomach sank when I saw one of the men, unmistakably younger Mr. Ward. I showed my parents, but they dismissed it. "He's only lived here 10 years, Dad said. I knew better. As the weeks passed, the cold spots in the hallway grew worse. The heater worked fine everywhere else, but the hallway near my room always felt like stepping into a freezer. One night I woke to a shadow standing at the foot of my bed. For a split second I thought it was my imagination. But then I saw him, Mr. Ward, motionless, hands in pockets, smiling silently in the dark. I froze, heart pounding like a drum. He didn't move or speak. Then slowly he turned and faded into the shadows. The next day I told my parents, but they didn't believe me, brushing it off. "You're just scared," Mom said. But I wasn't scared of anything that I could explain. This was something else. Something I couldn't put into words. Summer came, and we decided to move out. The tension, the strange noises, the cold, it was too much. 2 nights before we left, I woke to footsteps outside my window. I looked out and saw Mr. Ward standing on the back porch, hands in his pockets, watching silently. He smiled that same unsettling smile, as if he knew a secret I never would. We left that night, never looked back. Even now, years later, I wonder what it was all about. Was he a ghost? A man lost in time? Or something darker? What I do know is this. Sometimes the people who seem the most normal are hiding the strangest things. And sometimes it's better to trust your gut, even when others tell you it's nothing. If something feels wrong, don't ignore it just because it's easier to believe otherwise. Sometimes safety means listening to your own voice, even when no one else will. Moving to Portland felt like a lifeline. After a messy breakup back home in a tiny Illinois town, I craved a fresh start, somewhere that wasn't tangled in memories and hurt. I found a small apartment in the Bellevue Court Complex, a weathered building tucked into a quieter neighborhood, where old brick courtyards split the rows of apartments like narrow little streets. I didn't expect much, just a place to breathe, to be alone without the past lurking in every corner. My apartment 3B had a balcony overlooking the courtyard. I loved spending evenings there, watering my few struggling plants, mostly ferns and succulents I'd coaxed to life after the move. It was my little patch of calm. It was late February when I first saw him, the man across the courtyard in 5A. I'd just stepped onto my balcony with a watering can when I noticed movement. His window was open a crack, just enough to peek through the thin gap of curtains. He stood motionless, pale skin almost glowing under the dim yellow courtyard lights. His eyes found mine immediately, unblinking, his head tilting just slightly, as if he was memorizing my face. For a long moment, we just stared. I felt a prickle run down my spine. Then, slowly, he pulled back out of sight. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe he was lonely or curious. I was the new tenant after all. But that moment wouldn't leave me alone. Days passed, and the feeling of being watched settled over me like a shadow I couldn't shake. Every time I stepped onto my balcony, I'd catch the subtle shift of his curtain, like a slow blink just out of sight. When I left for work, I swear I heard his door click closed seconds after mine. And sometimes in the dead of night, through the pounding rain, I could see the faint orange glow of a cigarette smoldering on his balcony, the smoke curling up into the cold air. Then one evening, as I was locking my door, there was a sharp tap, just 2 quick knocks. I swung the door open, heart pounding, but no one was there. At my feet lay a small paperback book. I picked it up, flipping the worn cover. The Stranger, by Albert Camus. That was my favorite book. I'd never mentioned it to anyone. My hands trembled as I carried it inside. Who knew? How did he know? After that, little things started appearing. A scarf I'd lost in the laundry room was draped over my doorknob. A chipped coffee mug with my initials carved neatly into the side sat on the welcome mat. And the notes, always short, almost poetic. One read simply, "You look sad when you read." I never saw him deliver these, No footsteps, no voices. Just gifts left in silence, like breadcrumbs marking a path I didn't want to follow. When I started seeing someone from work, the fear grew worse. My boyfriend, Mark, was kind, steady, the kind of person who made me believe I could trust again. But one night, as Mark walked me to my door, I saw him again. Not across the courtyard, but standing in his apartment window, motionless in complete darkness. His eyes reflected faintly, locked on me, unblinking. The next morning, I found a crumpled Polaroid slipped under my door. It was a picture of Mark and me from the night before, taken from above, like from his balcony. I reported it to the building manager. Keeps to himself. He's been here for years, the manager said, dismissive. I called the police. Without real evidence, there's nothing we can do, the officer told me. My friends urged me to ignore it, pretend it wasn't happening. But every night the tapping began, slow, deliberate, from the bedroom wall, like someone knocking, waiting for an answer. One evening, I came home and found my front door unlocked. Nothing was missing, but my bed was made with unnatural precision, neater than I ever managed. On my pillow lay a single photo, me asleep, taken from just outside my bedroom door. That night, I pushed my dresser against the door, my hands shaking as I locked every deadbolt. Around 2 a.m., I woke to a faint creak, the sliding door to the balcony moving. Through the thin curtains, I saw him, not across the courtyard, but on my balcony. His eyes caught mine, unblinking, cold as winter. I screamed, grabbing my phone to call 911. The police arrived minutes later. When I looked again, he was gone, vanished like a ghost. I moved out 2 days later. Bellevue Court was no longer home. It was a prison of shadows and whispers. I never saw him again. But weeks ago, a small package arrived at my new apartment. No return address. Inside was my fern, still alive, carefully wrapped in damp paper, and a note, written in that same unmistakable hand. This courtyard has a better view. I folded the note slowly, staring at it long after the words sunk in. I'll never forget what happened in that place, or the man who watched me silently across the courtyard. Your safety and peace of mind matter more than politeness or ignoring discomfort. Boundaries exist for a reason. Trust your instincts, speak up, and protect yourself before the shadows grow too close. Moving to Portland felt like a breath of fresh air. After years of bouncing around freelance gigs and cramped apartments in bigger cities, I finally found a place that felt manageable. A faded brick building with a low rent, tucked close enough to downtown without the chaos. I'm Rachel Monroe, 28, an illustrator who lives mostly in her own head but craves connection. The moment I stepped into the apartment, I could smell cinnamon drifting in from the bakery downstairs, and it made me smile. The day I moved in, I met Ethan. He lived on the 3rd floor, just down the hall. Tall, quiet, with a voice so calm it reminded me of a late-night radio DJ. He helped me carry some of my heavier boxes inside, offering casual small talk that felt genuine but measured. Most people don't stay long in this building, he said with a half smile as we passed the dusty stairwell. I laughed it off, assuming it was a local joke, or maybe a warning I didn't want to hear. Over the next few weeks, Ethan was everywhere, knocking on my door in the mornings with coffee, leaving little sketches slid under my door with notes like, "This reminded me of you." It was sweet, almost romantic in an old-fashioned way. We talked for hours in the hallway about everything from art to music to movies. Sometimes when I worked late, I'd glance out my window to see him standing on his balcony, smoking silently, staring out at the street. He said he didn't sleep much, but beneath the kindness, I felt a growing unease. Something wasn't quite right. One night I was working at my drawing desk when I heard soft humming coming from just outside my door. It wasn't the usual polite knocking I expected, just a quiet, steady hum. Curious and a little unsettled, I peeked through the peephole and saw Ethan standing there, but he wasn't knocking. He just stood, staring at my door like it was some secret passage. The humming stopped the moment I moved away. I didn't open the door. A few days later, I had dinner with a coworker, a friendly guy I'd just met at a gallery event. The next morning, there was a note slipped under my door from Ethan. I don't like him. I hadn't mentioned my coworker to anyone, not even Ethan. How did he know? That's when the charm began to feel like a trap. Despite my growing discomfort, there was a magnetic pull I couldn't explain. Ethan seemed to understand me in ways no one else did, like he was the only real person in a building full of noise and ghosts. He told me once, "We're the only two real people in this building, Rachel. Everyone else is just noise." I laughed nervously, but inside, I felt the walls closing in. One rainy evening, my internet went out. I knocked on Ethan's door and he immediately offered me access to his Wi-Fi. His apartment was dim, illuminated only by a single lamp casting shadows across the walls. That's when I saw them. Dozens of charcoal portraits, pinned in neat rows. They were all of me. Some were recent sketches, while others looked older, even predating my move-in date. One chilling portrait showed me sleeping, eyes closed and peaceful. My breath caught in my throat. Ethan smiled gently, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. "You're beautiful when you dream," he said softly. I made a clumsy excuse and left as quickly as I could. That night I pushed my desk against the door, heart hammering. The next morning, taped to the door was a single flower and a note. "You don't need to be afraid. You belong here. With me." The building still smelled faintly of cinnamon, but I couldn't breathe without feeling watched. My safe place had turned into a cage. Every time I turned around, Ethan seemed to know what I was thinking, what I planned before I even said it. When I talked about moving, his smile would flicker with something unreadable. One night I caught him standing just outside my door, hands folded, silently waiting. I didn't open it. Instead, I whispered through the crack, "Please leave me alone." He didn't answer but tilted his head as if hearing a secret no one else could. I'm writing this from my new apartment now, miles away from the old building. I've changed my number, my routines, everything. Yet sometimes when I'm alone and the night is quiet, I feel a presence, the memory of that watchful gaze and the weight of unseen eyes. I still get small notes slipped under my door in this new place, unsigned but unmistakably his style. Kindness that feels like control isn't kindness at all. Boundaries are sacred, and no amount of charm can replace respect for your autonomy. If you ever feel that creeping sense of being watched or followed, don't ignore it. Protect yourself before the line between concern and obsession blurs.